area to service those sorts of facilities, is it? It seems to have sufficient space to pick up those new types of support activities?
Well, it's actually a strategy of ours at the moment, which is to maintain flexibility, particularly around the Eastern Reclamation and the New Plymouth Power Station site, so that we can support Taranaki as it transitions towards a new energy future. Because we're going to be in a situation at some point in the future where our main product that goes through the port, which is related to fossil fuel, will subside and then eventually be replaced with renewable energy. I think it's realistic to assume that within the next 10 to 15 years, we will see offshore wind farms and we will see renewable production stations, whether it be at the port or somewhere else, who knows, but we're certainly maintaining flexibility on the land that we have so that it can be at the port.
Yes. So as the only port of any size on the west coast, the
only deep water port on the
only deep water port, yes.
West, yep.
Yes. I know enough about industrial location theory that if there are these projects evolving, people that are looking at sites will want access to a deep water port otherwise it just can't, the cost of transportation otherwise is just, really counts out some of these areas. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do. Proximity is extremely important. Right. And I think, in Port Taranaki, we've got proximity to the offshore resource, and we've also got proximity to a very good engineering industry that's been supporting the oil and gas industry for 50 years. And those two components make Taranaki a very interesting prospect to offshore wind developers.
Okay, thank you for that. David, did you have any questions for Ross?
Yeah, possibly. Thank you, Mr. Dingle. I read your evidence with interest because I guess it provides the backstory as to why ports are listed as national and regionally significant infrastructure in the higher order documents. So thank you for that. Just on the offshore wind farm, if it was to occur, and by the very nature of the term, it presumably wouldn't be in the port zone, it'd be in the coastal marine area. Is that your understanding?
It would be, so can I just clarify that question? The offshore wind park itself would be way out to sea, outside of the port zone.
Yes.
Correct. However, to support that, there's going to be ongoing operations and maintenance, which involves vessels going to and from the wind park. They need a port. And, when you think about replacing a wind turbine blade or a nacelle, those need to be stored and possibly fabricated, certainly maintained within an environment with easy access to the wharf, hence inside the port zone. And particularly the Eastern Reclamation, which is 20,000 square metres of flat land, very close to a wharf, is an ideal location for that.
Yes, no, I understand. I have some familiarity with wind farms. I've sat on 6 different hearings over the last decade or two. So I understand the terminology and the provisions you refer to, but in terms of the storage and operational support for an offshore wind farm, what's the point you're trying to make in terms of height limits in the port zone itself in Area B?
Well, I'd go as far as to say they've got to be reasonable and practical. Because we don't have offshore wind operation and maintenance facilities in New Zealand at all, it's difficult for me to give you a height limit.
Yes. But we're talking about storage, aren't we, presumably?
Yep.
Predominantly.
Yep. But, there's probably going to be cranes involved, various other items of machinery which will have a high height to lift blades, move them around. You know, I'd expect that. I don't expect you'd be standing them up in the
No.
port area.
No.
But, you know, the technology is developing to the extent that they're using floating pontoons now. And, you know, those are stood up before they're taken out to sea. And those can be 200 or 300 metres high.
Sure. So what are you telling us about the height limits in terms of Area B then?
I don't think I'm talking about the area height limits per se. I'm talking about the ability to conduct that type of activity within Area B. I don't think Area B, as it is at the moment, allows that to happen.
Okay.
And what I'd like it to do is actually expressly allow that to happen.
Okay. And Ms. Carter, are you going to pick this point up?
Yes, I will pick this up.
Okay. Okay, I'll leave that there. That was all. Thank you, Mr. Dingle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Just if you unshare your screen, we'll get everyone back online.
I'm just trying to figure out how to do that.
Better you than me, I tell you.
Should be the green arrow. Yeah.
Green arrow?
Green arrow at the bottom of your screen. It says share screen. If you click that again.
Yeah, no, I can't. I'm not being able to. Oh, here we go.
Oh, there you go.
Have I unshared now?
You have?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yes, really interesting evidence. Thank you, Ross. Are we moving now to
Ms. Williams?
Julia. Hello, Julia.
Kia ora, Commissioners. I thought I've prepared some speaking notes. I'm slightly flummoxed by the fact that you are operating remotely and won't have printed copies in front of you. So I'm going to recommend that you perhaps turn to the figure that's attached at the end of my speaking notes, because I'd cunningly figured that you might have had about 20 iterations of plans laid out in front of you, and I could be quite specific with this. Because I want to start just by referencing the sort of context, which is I'm looking at the Port Precinct map, and my evidence focuses entirely on sub-precinct A and sub-precinct C.
Julia, I think you've sent through some notes. So that's is a diagram you're talking to attached to that?
It is indeed, yes.
Yes.
I would share my screen with you, but alas, it is beyond my technological abilities.
Yes. Christine, you've circulated those, I think.
Yes, yeah, I have. Would you like me just to share my screen, because I've got it up on there now?
That would be wonderful, thank you.
Yes, okay.
Is that the one, Julia?
That's the one, thank you very much, Christine. My other, as well as the port plan, my other point of reference is figure 1 of the building heights report, which effectively generated, if you like, the height limitation requirements across the port zone. And so figure 1 of the building heights report, which is shown here with some red annotations on it, contains a panoramic photograph of the port viewed from Kawerau Park, some 2 kilometres from areas A and C. The figure illustrates a perceptual limit line and shows how that line was generated based on the perceived relationship that's perceived as one might see it between landforms and existing port structures and buildings. And Mr. Dingle has jumped ahead by providing you with some context and some photos of some of those structures and buildings, which I think I might say at the start, it is quite confusing when you look in a view like this, for any person to simply work out what you're looking at and how close it is to you and how large it might be. So sub-precinct A, the area A, encompasses a large area over a highly modified site. And it's my opinion that the proposed 20-metre building height limit is a blunt instrument for spatially managing the nature and scale of existing and future development on such a large scale site, especially when based on a view of the area from a point on the coastal walkway some 2 kilometres away. So that's this figure 1 photograph that you're looking at is actually an enlargement of a panorama, and the actual view is 2 kilometres from the eastern extent of the area A. The same figure 1 contains several inaccuracies, the most significant of which is the height of the power station, turbine hall shed 7. So that is shown in this diagram as C power station, where it was estimated at 20 metres high, and in reality it's 30.6 metres high. I have set out a table actually in my evidence of the estimated and actual height of port buildings and structures, but I've illustrated it here sort of for clarity. Based on the heights, the actual heights of existing built development in Area A, I recommend that views are managed through a more targeted site-specific range of, and as part of the process, building structure heights should be considered in conjunction with ground levels and converted to RLs, levels relative to sea level, in order to more accurately calculate height limitations. So if I take you back to this figure 1, the red dotted line, which is Mr. Bain's perceptual limit line, as it goes to the right of Paritutu, sits at 20 metres. And you will notice that the power station, which had an estimated height of 20 metres, is actually 30 metres high. So that's telling you that a building in any development in the vicinity of where the existing power station is could be 30 metres high and could comfortably sit below that perceptual limit line. I'll note too that while we're looking at this, that the port isn't a plane. It doesn't sit on a nice smooth table. It's a mixture of existing landform and reclaimed land and extensively earthworked land. I mean, rather, most regrettably, there probably would have been a lot more of the background landform pre any existence of port, because that has been used as fill effectively for the reclamation. So within the port itself, there's actually a multitude of bunds and small sort of moated areas and terraces, and in the sort of southern corner of area A, it actually extends over part of the hill slope. So building heights themselves are probably less useful than converting them to relative levels, so that you might, for example, say you have a building height across the port. If you were to go, in a certain area, instead of say 20 metres there, you might say 20, RL 24 metres, so that you're looking at effectively setting an upper operational height. Not shown quite so clearly in this is Area C, which is a much smaller area than Area A, and it's sitting up effectively above, on the landform above the power station. The site has been cut and benched into a series of terraces linked by embankments. Because it's a more complex site than assumed in the building height report, I'd recommend that the permitted building height established for the upper terrace be set as an RL across the whole site. I've illustrated that in some cross sections I've provided in my evidence. And given the considerable viewing distances to this area, again, it's 2 metres. I would suggest that a pragmatic solution would set a height limit consistent with the 10-metre Papawhero Mount Motoroa view shaft height at RL 52. That's the end of my speaking notes. Please, have you got any questions?
Dean, perhaps just unshare. Here we go. Thank you for that, Julia. I certainly like the idea, given that this is obviously quite a dynamic area and quite a complex area in terms of height. I quite like the idea that in terms of disagreement that you, Julia, and Richard might have some further discussion about this. But I'm wondering whether we could just start that in a bit of a sort of a collaborative way now by perhaps Richard, or there's probably some key diagrams that you could point to in your evidence, Julia, and we could have, this one here we've seen is probably the key one, and just to get some feedback from Richard, and then get a bit of dialogue going between you. That's quite a good technique to perhaps see where any differences still lie, and if we can get some agreement, that's great. If we can't, we can at least listen to where the differences lie. So would you be comfortable with that, Julia and Richard, just talking through that in that way?
Certainly, yes.
Sure.
Okay. So Julia, would you like to just lead, or maybe for a start, Richard, you could just respond to Julia's notes and this diagram that we've seen?
Yes, I accept there's some differences in the heights of the structures, and I mean, even in the presentation we've just seen on Mr. Dingle's slide, he had the bitumen tanks at 20.25 on his diagram, and on Julia's, she's got them at 24 point something, I think. So there is some differences. I'm not suggesting I'm correct and other people are wrong, but there are differences. So I think we perhaps need to just establish what those are. I think with regard to the turbine building that's over 30 meters high, and I accept that it's that height, my understanding of Julia's evidence is she's suggesting that something that high in that part of the site would fall below my so-called limit line. I agree with that, but that's not how area A is framed at the moment. It is one zone, one area, to enable taller buildings to be in the area where the where the turbine building is. We would have to start divvying up area A because you can have taller structures closer to Paratutu as viewed from the city because of that foreshortening effect. So my 20-meter height limit, which is pretty much the height of those bitumen tanks that are in front of Mikitahi, I've used that as an overall cautionary height over the site. And even though I accept that there are parts of the site that could have taller buildings that would fall below that line. But like I say, I have assumed that area A is a one height area. If you're going to break area A up into several areas, I'm not sure how one would undertake that in a simple, manageable way.
Are you okay if I respond to that?
Yes, sure. Yes.
I think at the very basic nuance would be to have effectively the floor plan turbine building, and there's two associated buildings of about the same height by it. I mean, essentially what figure 1 shows us is that a building of 30 meters high there sits below Paratutu, and it doesn't compromise its mana, if you like. And so, that would be a reasonably easy one to look at. But the port area is huge. It's a meter it's 1 kilometre long and 600 metres wide. It's a very extensive area, and I guess it's my opinion that 20 metres is overly precautionary, and that there could be a bit more nuance found around the port. Essentially, if we're relying on the fact that it's the views from the east that are really the fundamentally important views, because that's the one where you see the port in the foreground and Paritutu and Ngā and Mount Motoroa, in the background, if you like, framing the port, then it's very clear in those views on the coastal walkway that once you get about to the lee breakwater, existing buildings on the site that are quite low, like, let me see, I'm just looking for the storage sheds, which I think are the Craig Norgate sheds. They're only 14.9 metres high, and they're effectively screening development behind. So we've got essentially a section of the walkway that we can look at. And I think that that if Richard and I work together, we probably could look at putting a little bit, we could maybe create a third area. At the moment, I'm suggesting that we could actually leave it at 2 areas, one that's a very well-defined 30-metre high height limit, and putting a 24-metre height limit across the rest of the port. As Richard said, it is dictated. The information I had was that the tanks were 24.85 metres high. Mind you, there's a plethora of tanks, so we could clarify that. But certainly, in terms of Mikotahi, preserving the integrity of that, I think there are opportunities. We could close down the, if you like, the view, the significant view shaft to quite a limited section of the coastal walkway, if you like, and we could, I don't know whether, Richard, you'd be prepared to agree on at least a subdivision into 2 areas of Area A.
Yes, I can answer that. I mean, subdividing it into areas is fine. I don't have any issue with that at all, and I completely take your point. I'm not sure how the planning staff will feel about cutting Area A up, but that's for them to respond to. Just with your other suggestion for Area C being the same as the view shaft, I agree that It makes some sense to have that the same, just for pragmatism. So I don't have issue with that. With your reduced level approach, I agree with that. I'm just mindful that we don't use reduced levels anywhere else in the plan. Our building heights are always above existing ground levels at the time of subdivision. It's not to say they couldn't occur here, but they do. Building height isn't measured that way in anywhere else in the plan. Perhaps the planners might respond to that. But in principle, I agree with you that what is the more relevant is the height above sea level, because you get a more consistent plane that way. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. And I'll just go back to reiterate, to the commissioners that I mean, it is an incredibly modified site. So you can't, it's not like looking at a greenfield subdivision or something and you've got ground levels. You've got benches and embankments. I mean, you can only have a very vague idea of what the landform might have been before man and bulldozer, or man and pickaxe probably, set about. So, I mean, it does sound like that you and I, Richard, have some areas of consistency, areas of agreement to start with. Sure. And I'd be very happy. Well, I'm not sure how. In this hearing at the moment, I don't think we could probably go much further in terms of looking at Area A. Yes, but I do think that we could, and perhaps we will need some planning advice on whether the planners are happy to have their plan set upon. But I think it would be useful to look at areas that perhaps we could we could set some figures on, and was all within the context of this incredibly important landform and coastal background.
Julia and Rich, I tend to agree. We're sort of limited to running effective process, looking at the screen and back and forth. And we have had quite a lot of interest in post-hearing conferencing. I'm a big fan of planners conferencing with specialist experts, just looking at both the landscape and the in those sort of technical matters in relation to the plan. So if Janice and Hamish thought there could be some value in some further discussions around this, now that we've got the evidence and the work that Julie has done, I'd certainly encourage that. Janice?
Yeah, I would definitely be interested, particularly just the technical issue of the height and where these areas could be in terms of a map.
Jacob, sorry. Yeah. Jacob, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, likewise. I think that could be valuable. I know that we've got some more landscape evidence tomorrow,
Yes.
just to point that out.
Yes, there's certainly some evidence from Maruli, I think. And
Yes. So,
yes.
so just be aware that though, where this, particularly if we look at the evidence that's coming tomorrow, is where this is going to lead to, probably is we'll have several sub areas of Area A for height.
Mm.
Yeah. Yes, and I picked up perhaps from Mr. Stenner at the beginning of the hearing that Mikotahi has a huge importance, and again there are view shafts from significant areas, and so there may be nuances within nuances required.
We'd certainly want to make sure that Sarah and Maria and any other experts there were involved in any further discussions. That's as Jacob's pointed out. So I think just for the principle of this evidence here today, I think the discussion back and forth has indicated yes, there's some good planning reasons to do some further work, and I can't see any particular planning reasons why you wouldn't look to perhaps split it up a little bit more, seeing it's such a big area, but that's something for the planners to think about and come back to us. All right, Julia, was there anything else you wanted to highlight?
No, not that I can think of.
Okay, David, do you have any questions?
Not necessarily, Stephen. Certainly you've been following the conversation quite closely, and I think the idea of the conferencing between expert landscape architects and expert planners is a very sensible one. I would say to the landscape architects, focus on the key issue about appropriate heights. Don't get too caught up in how that might translate into planning, because that's the role for the planners. And if it means Area A is sliced and diced for the purpose of height, then so be it. It's a very large area, and it serves a purpose in terms of activities, but it might be able to be further subdivided in terms of buildable heights. So focus on what's acceptable from the resource point of view in terms of accommodating height, and leave it to the planners to sort out how that might manifest its way into the rules in terms of subzones or how height is actually prescribed in the subzones. That would be my only advice, Stephen.
Yes,
Right.
sure. Sarah, Mako, are you're following this? And we'll hear from you tomorrow. You do have some technical evidence as well, but are you generally comfortable with some further discussions in this space?
Yeah, yes, definitely. So the technical evidence that has been produced is by Ngāti Te Whiti Whenua Tōpū.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
Whenua
Yes.
Tōpū Trust haven't particularly been part of our sort of our collective tangata whenua submissions to date. But yeah, we have discussed with Whenua Tōpū as well. So
okay, well, we'll see where we get to together. So yes, this and we have sometimes directed by way of a minute, but just sometimes by agreement of the parties through agreeing in the verbal right of reply that there will be some further conferencing. So we'll get to that tomorrow, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much, Julia. Good to see you again. Julia and I started off work in the same office quite a few years ago in Wellington, so it's nice to catch up again. Right, so we are now going to move to you, Janice, I think.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Look, a lot of the issues on the landscape have just been traversed, which is in my summary. So I think I'll skip that, and if that's okay, because it repeats exactly what Julia has just said in her evidence. Yes. But I do identify in my summary the higher order documents, including the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, the Regional Policy Statement, and the Regional Coastal Plan at paragraphs 28 to 42. So I just wanted to emphasise that those have been covered. PTL submissions. Do you have my summary in front of you? Yes. Okay. So I'll just carry on. So PTL was involved in the early drafting of the port zone, and we really appreciated the process that enabled early input. So in some respects, that's why there's not as much to deal with now as what we might have had to deal with. This evidence, as I've said in my evidence in chief, focuses on the remaining areas of disagreement, which are of particular concern to PTL. Much of PTL's submission is concerned to ensure that as Taranaki transitions to a low emissions economy, that there is flexibility in the district planning framework to enable this transition. Mr. Dingle has discussed at previous hearings and at this hearing, future development options currently being considered by PTL. Aside from its role as an operational port of significance to the region, Port Taranaki is a lifeline utility under CDM 2002. It is noted that lifeline utilities provide essential infrastructure services that support communities, enable business, and underpin the provision of public services. Now, the height of buildings and structures, I think that I could probably skip that part of my summary since we've canvassed it quite a lot, and I don't see anything different to what's already been said by Ms. Williams. So if you're happy for me to go to paragraph 9.
Yes.
Okay. So flexibility in the type of port activities within the Eastern Reclamation. PTL has sought greater flexibility in the type of port-related activities that can occur as permitted activities within the mixed-use port area under Rule Press 10 R3, particularly the Eastern Reclamation. In my opinion, there is scope for a greater range of permitted activities. This view is supported by the wording of the Policy 3, Ports Policy 3, which lists port activities as defined in the plan as compatible activities in all sub-precinct areas. And this includes the port mixed-use area. I also consider that compliance with the effects standards already provided for in respect to maximum height in relation to boundary, setbacks, and landscaping already address issues of scale. And that's not to say that we couldn't also include anything else that the planning officers felt was missing in that area of effects standards. But generally, I think there's no reason why we couldn't have a greater range of permitted activities identified in this area, in supporting Mr. Dingle's presentation about the wind farm, wind park areas. So as I'm going to say that PTL are investigating the use of the Eastern Reclamation for a wind farm set down area. So just to be clear, not a wind farm, but a wind farm set down area is what's asked for in terms of this area. The activity is considered compatible on the northern part of the Eastern Reclamation, as explained by Mr. Dingle. I propose some amendments to PREC 10 R3 to enable these activities as permitted activities at the end of the summary. And there's a small table at the end where I just provide some track changes that may accommodate what we're discussing here. At the end of the table, I haven't mentioned the activity status, but another part of our submission, we actually ask for it to be restricted discretionary rather discretionary when there's non-compliance with the precinct effects standards. We'll move on now to
just to clarify what you're actually seeking.
Yeah.
Your evidence in chief doesn't actually include a markup of the provisions that I can see.
No, if you, my original evidence in chief describes this and describes the wording, and the wording I've described in my evidence in chief is what I've put in blue at the end.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was just, I didn't have time in my evidence chief to actually mark up a version, but I thought it would be helpful now to mark up a version.
Yes, we've asked that of all the planners in our minute 5. So was that just you're out of time or?
Out of time, absolutely.
Yes. And that's why I think perhaps normally we just go through the planner's evidence and look at the changes that you're seeking to the provisions in a format. That's why we issued that decision. So that minute requiring both marked up provision on top of the 42A reporters and also a 32AA analysis. You haven't provided us a 32AA for the proposed changes either, have you?
No, I haven't. I would have thought that my evidence itself provides that analysis of section 32 as to why it's more appropriate.
No, have you read our minute 5, Ms. Carter?
I have read your minute 5. Well, I'm happy to provide you with additional section 32 assessment if that's what you're requesting.
Is that every other planner that's appearing before us has been diligently providing us with the complete markups of changes that they're seeking on behalf of their clients in the appendix, and a 32AA response to that, because those otherwise, if you're seeking changes and the staff aren't supporting you, who prepares the 32AA analysis? We can't do that just without evidence and clear guidance. So yes, and the reason I've raised it at this stage is that you mentioned in your markup at the end of your summary that perhaps this proposed changes doesn't cover everything that you're seeking, or does it? Does the proposed changes in the back of your summary, is that the full extent of the changes you're seeking to the provisions?
Oh, yes, it is, except that I've forgotten a column at the end of the very first one, land use activities, press 10 S1. There's also an activity status at the end of that table. I haven't shown that in the evidence we've asked for restricted discretionary rather than discretionary at the end of that. So that's a typo that I have not included.
Okay. So
the rest of the changes that we're seeking are there.
Just coming back to the question of timing, is it, again, I think you had the full 2 weeks after the 42A report. That's been notified for quite a while. Is there just that you were too busy to do this this job?
Yeah, well, I signalled in my evidence in chief that I would provide it at the hearing. So that's the best I could do at the time. So I signalled, and there's a paragraph which states what wording I'm looking for this mixed use port area. And I state, I'll just find the paragraph.
That's not really the point. I think it's really, this is about the 5th topic I've heard in the last week or two, and just keeping track of the submissions as they're coming in. We set some very clear timelines and some clear requirements for planners presenting for us. So it does make it difficult, particularly over the Zoom platform, to really get the gist of what you're asking us to do. So I think let's just finish that there. We would appreciate a full markup of the changes you're recommending, including that typo you mentioned, plus a 32AA analysis of the changes that you're seeking. That can come to us perhaps by the end of the week, if that would be suitable.
That would be fine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for your indulgence in that. I'll carry on. So the next paragraph is Maori purpose activities. Maori purpose activities include marae and pa and have been inadvertently recommended by the reporting planner to be included as compatible activities in the mixed use port area under Port Policy 3. I consider it appropriate to retain marae pa activities as incompatible activities within the port zone, given that they are sensitive activities. Matters of restricted discretion for rules and PREC 10. So a broad range of matters of restricted discretion have been recommended by the reporting planner to be added to the restricted discretionary rules in PREC 10. These matters of restricted discretion are further broadened in the reporting planner's preliminary recommendation in respect to the coastal environment chapter. I am particularly concerned with the use of words non-scheduled features, as this would appear to considerably open up the matters of discretion is restricted to. In my opinion, it is not clear if this means any features that are not listed in the 10 schedules in the PDP. In my opinion, those words add ambiguity and uncertainty to the matters of discretion that the matters of discretion is restricted to and should not be accepted by the panel. My final paragraphs are on the coastal environment. I support exempting Port Taranaki from the provisions of the coastal environment. However, in my opinion, the reporting planner's recommendations in respect to the addition of the coastal environment policies as matters of restricted discretion for the rules in PREC 10 results in an overly complex and onerous list of matters of restricted discretion that does not support the overall objectives of the port zone. A port activity under PREC 10 R3 and the Port Operational Area A that did not meet the maximum height would have to consider all the additional matters outlined in paragraphs 68 and 69 of my evidence. In my opinion, PREC 10's S1 matters of discretion clauses 4 and 5 already require any potential impacts of on landscape features, cultural and historic heritage, the coastal environment, loss of views, and impacts on Mikatahi Pa, Paratutu, and Mount Moturua, such that these additions recommended by the reporting planner are unnecessary. Conclusion, I consider it important to recognise that ports have a functional need to be located within the coastal environment and that it is appropriate to continue to provide for Port Taranaki in its existing location and ensure future development is not unduly constrained. This applies to the provision of maximum building heights and the range of activities permitted within the port zone, including at the Eastern Reclamation. As per paragraphs 31, 38, and 39 of my evidence in chief, flexibility can be afforded to Port Taranaki within the PDP to give effect to the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, Policy 6 and 9, and the RPS, CNC Policy 3, Port Taranaki, while respecting and giving effect to Policies 13 and 15 of the NZCPS and CNC Policies 1 and 2 of the RPS. And the last page is the track change version, where I've already explained the first one, and the second one is just putting in how it might look in terms of the table for the 30 metre and the 24 metre for Port Operational Area A. And I note that those areas would need to be mapped, and that, yeah, we've already discussed that the landscape architects and the planners could conference on that. And with the S13, Port Operational Area C, I've just put down there the 52 RL. And I think, yes, there would have to be supporting planning information on how that's measured compared to the other heights in the plan.
Thank you. Thank you, Janice. David, questions?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Carter. One for you and one for Mr. Slyfield. But firstly, I only just received your summary around about the lunchtime period, so I'd been working off your evidence in chief. So that's why I didn't have the track changes in front of me. So the matters that you raised in relation to or everything other than height, really, Maori purpose activities, the matters of discretion, the coastal environment, and there was one other, the restricted discretionary matter, are really matters for Mr. Steiner to respond to in his right of reply, and I'll I'll leave that to him. The question I have for you is in relation to the change. I'll just find it. Sorry, just bear with me. Ah, yes. So it was the range of activities in the mixed use port area. Were you seeking that additional activity would apply to the entirety of Area B or just the Eastern Reclamation area within Area B?
So the Eastern Reclamation, I think Mr. Dingle provided a map showing the Area B is yellow, but the area that we're looking at is the area just north of that.
Yes.
So we're looking at an area in there. In the original submission, we actually circled it in pen, but just being more sort of nuanced about that, it is the area just north of what is currently coloured yellow.
Yes,
so we're not looking at the eastern part where there's marine facilities. We're just looking at that area where the photograph Mr. Dingle
share my
showed.
screen again?
Yeah.
Let me try this. Let me know when you can see it.
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
So it's really this whole reclaimed area where my cursor is going around
Yes.
is the area that we're referring to within the Eastern Reclamation.
Okay. Right. And so now that I've seen, thank you, Mr. Dingle. Now that I've seen your track change version, Mr. Carter, that changes to Area B in totality, isn't it? That you're seeking the provision for wind park operations.
So at the moment,
sorry, it's mixed use port area.
yes,
Sorry,
so my changes are keeping it as mixed use, but providing for a greater range of port activities within that mixed use zone. So it's not asking for it to be Port B, but to keep it as mixed use, but
Yes.
include those activities.
Yes, no, I understand. Is there any need for definitions of the terms wind park operations and the like, or are they fairly obvious?
I mean, we could have a go in terms of having to reply by the end of the week for the Section 32 AA. I'm happy to have a look at that if the planners think it's worthwhile that we come up with a definition. But
Yes.
it really is set down area.
Yes.
That's a commonly understood word. I wouldn't want to restrict it to a wind farm from planning point of view, but obviously that's what the port is looking for.
Yeah, and that's what your blue writing says though too.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. And I guess the point is that the rule precinct 10 S1 standard at the moment only provides for the temporary landing of cargo or the beaching of a ship or mooring visit. So it wouldn't provide for that necessarily for that set down area in your view.
No, it doesn't. No.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
It's just,
there is a couple of other just matters before I get to Mr. Slyfield, and that is you referred to an inadvertent error by Mr. Steno in relation to married purpose activities in the policy.
yes.
So you're thinking that wasn't intentional, that was something that's happened inadvertently.
Yeah, I've said inadvertently because there is exclusion there for Papakanga,
Yes.
which is the normal living sensitive activity, but marae and pa can have living overnight as well. And I just wanted to make sure that was
Sure.
captured as a sensitive activity.
Yes, I did question Mr. Steno on that this morning. I don't know if you heard that.
Yes, I did.
Okay, all right. Well, the ball's back in Mr. Stener's court on that one. And the matters of restricted discretion and rule priest 10, Mr. That's your paragraph 12, but in your evidence in chief, you go into a lot more detail, paragraph 61 through to 64. Mr. Slyfield, you've raised the issue of scope here. Are you relying on Ms. Carter's analysis to take that matter forward, or will you go? What's the situation there?
Take myself off mute. I raised the issue of scope in a deliberately light way. It's not intended to be pursued actively on a scope basis. I'd raised it really out of a sense of wanting it to be complete, and rather I'm relying on Ms. Carter's evidence to advance that matter.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that. It's something that we'd like. I guess I'd like Mr. Stenner to respond to in terms of this narrow issue of scope.
Sure.
But Ms. Carter, on the substance of the matter, you've raised doubt as to whether the matter of discretion is certain, and you said it's not clear when it's talking about non-listed or non-scheduled features, what it's referring to. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes, so I had a look at what scheduled features were, and there's 10 schedules. So I've assumed, looking at that it means something that's not in one of the schedules.
Yes.
So in terms of a matter of discretion, does that mean that everything that's not scheduled is captured by this matter of discretion? And that's what the issue is to do with scope, is that there might be appropriate additional matter of discretion that takes into account the concerns of Ngāti Te Whiti, for example. But the way this one has been drafted, it just seems to capture so much. And I'm just wondering if that's unintended, or whether there's someone else knows what non-scheduled features are.
Yes.
Because if I can't tell what it is as a planner, I'm wondering how anyone else will know what it is.
I think the two issues here, one is intention and the second's delivery. What you may not be aware of is during the course of the last handful of hearings, hazardous substances, subdivision, and then the right of reply on natural features and SNAs. And I think also in the verbal right of reply on SASMs, and there's been a desire of the officers, and I think of some witnesses, to distinguish between scheduled and non-scheduled features at both the policy and rule level. And so to explain that very simply, there's been an attempt to have the policies apply to all of the resource, regardless of whether it's scheduled or non-scheduled, but have the rules apply only to the scheduled resource. So for example, if you take the SASM as an example, policies refer to sites in areas of interest to Maori without initial caps as a construct, as a wider resource, but the rules, as a general rule, refer to scheduled or identified sites in schedules. And the attempt, the endeavour there, or the rationale behind that, or the intention, was to have a policy recognition of that resource, even though there weren't necessarily specific rules in that chapter dealing with it, so that if a resource consent was required for another reason, and it was discovered during that resource consent process that there was a site of significance that was unscheduled, that at least there was a policy regime to help in the decision making on that resource consent application. So that's sort of the background to it. Doesn't quite necessarily explain the matter of discretion, I accept, because that's a rule as opposed to a policy. But that was my understanding of the rationale or intention between distinguishing between non-scheduled and scheduled features. And normally the term non-scheduled features was accompanied by a list of what those features might include, such as natural features, landscapes, water bodies, indigenous biodiversity, historic heritage, and sites as areas of significance, which all have schedules associated them with when they are initial cap features, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm just wondering though that do we actually know what non-scheduled features are then, if that's the case? They obviously have characteristics of some of the scheduled areas. Maybe they're adjacent to them, or maybe they haven't been captured in the extent, or maybe they're just a little bit not quite nice enough to be scheduled, but they're nice enough anyway. So what I'm trying to get my head around is, how does a resource consent planner know what is a non-scheduled feature? And where's the cutoff? Is it everything that's not scheduled? As I said, it seems to me that it could be a puddle, that's a water body, but it's not scheduled. So is that a non-scheduled feature? I'm being a little bit flippant here, because I really struggle to see how a resource consent planner can get their head around this.
I understand what you're saying. All I've differentiated is between the intention and the delivery.
Okay.
And at a policy and rule level, as opposed to the matter that's in front of us. I don't know about. I don't have a view on the efficacy of that rule or any other rules. So that's for, I guess that's for the reporting officer to come back. But all I'm signaling is that this approach doesn't appear to be limited to this zone.
Right. So it's been plugged in from assessment of other
as I understand it, and Jacob and others, and Hamish and that might want to comment on that in terms of their hazardous substances and port zone experience. But I understand it's also germane to subdivision, SASM, sites and natural features, natural environments. So, and it's usually come back in through the right of reply, written right of reply. No question there. It's a very long statement. I apologise for it.
It's getting late in the day. I'm wondering, you were sort of inviting Jacob and Hamish to comment, but is that something to come back in the morning on? I'm not sure. It's Hamish.
I could just briefly comment. I think Commissioner McMahon's described it well in terms of the intent of the response around scheduled and non-scheduled features across all the different topics over the last probably 6 weeks of hearings, and it's I think that's where the officers have been coming back from consistently, and I think Janice raises a fair question in terms of how would the non-scheduled policy direction be applied in practice.
Probably as far as you can take it, Hamish, at this point.
Yeah.
Apologies, David. I interrupted.
No, I was just saying that's probably as far as Hamish could take that. I just wanted to share that with the witness, Stephen, because I became apparent that she wasn't necessarily aware of that, and that's not a criticism, just an observation.
Okay, have you finished your questions?
I have.
Yes. So Janice, I want to take you just back to that issue about the coastal environment interface, and just it's really to get clear on my own mind where this issue is sitting between you and Mr. Stenner and Ms. Macbeth, because there is an interface with the coastal zone coming up. So can I just, your summary at 13, you start with, I support exempting Port Taranaki from the provisions of the coastal environment.
So that should be the rules. Actually, I've used the word provision. That should be rules.
Okay. So if we wrote in, I support exempting Port Taranaki from the rules of the coastal environment, that would be a more accurate statement for you?
Yes.
Okay, this is where this was the genesis of my discussions earlier on, because I have read your summary. So I wonder then, could we turn our minds to where I understand Mr. Stenner's at, and starting at 274 of his section 42A report?
Yes, got it.
So maybe you could read into the record the first sentence of 274, just so we're on the same page.
I'm generally comfortable with the approach whereby the CE chapter rules can exempt the port. That's what Mr. Stenner says.
And so that's, you're in agreement with that.
Yes.
But then just flowing through, he's talking about some policy gaps, but at page 279, and I've asked Mr. Stenner about this morning, perhaps again, you'd like to read us through that, and then I've got a question. 279.
So based on the above, the preliminary position is that the port zone chapter, as a standalone chapter, would need some amendments to manage the activities in the zone in accordance with the NZCPS. Following discussions with Ms. Macbeth, we are in agreement that the following policies would still need to be assessed in relation to any development within the port zone, which goes beyond those anticipated as a permitted activity.
Okay, so is that your position as well? That I understand it's not. So the following policies, and they're listed on the following 2 pages. So CEP2, CEP3, CEP7, CEP8, CEP11, CEP12, CEP13. So his position is that any development up top of over and above a permanent activity would need to be assessed in relation to all of those policies as well. So just what is your position in relation to that?
If we go on to paragraph 280, Mr. Stenner then says, to achieve this, the following matter of discretion would need to be added to all the rules within Prece 10. So he is also only suggesting that these policies be added to as matters of discretion. So if you read 280 on its face, he's basically saying those policies would be added as matters of discretion, which increases the length of the matters of discretion that are already there, as I've said in my evidence. And it's adding them to the matters of discretion that I think is where we have a dispute, because I'm not suggesting that if there was, for example, a hazardous facility locating in the coastal environment and it was a fully discretionary activity, I'm not suggesting that the policies in the coastal environment wouldn't be relevant. I think they would. So what we're saying here is that when it comes down to something that's a restricted discretionary activity in the port zone, in my view, there's already enough matters of discretion that cover the coastal environment, and to add on all these matters set out in those policies is too much, overly complex in terms of what we need to do here in terms of drafting the rule. There's already reference, if it was height, for instance, that the activity didn't comply with, there's already reference to the coastal environment in the matter of discretion for height. And that's one of the areas where you can go from permitted to restricted discretionary if you don't comply with the height requirements. And the matters of discretion for height already reference the coastal environment. So in my view, adding on all these policies to the end of the matters of restricted discretions are necessary and complex. I also would argue that any matter of discretion that says the matter set out and then lists a row of policies, it's going to be open to problems for a resource consent planner as well, because those policies don't necessarily specify matters. They're policy direction. They may have some matters depending on how they're drafted, but it's very difficult to get matters out of policies unless they're written that way. So you've got a whole list of things that in the coastal environment that are added here as policies to be considered as matters of discretion, which I think is just overly complex.
That is a common approach in this plan. We have commented on that before, but quite often we've either had that justified that the policies are tight enough that they can be matters, or there's no scope to change them. So I'll perhaps agree with you in principle that it's not the greatest approach, but that's what we have in a number of parts of the plan. But look, coming to the nub of the issue, and this is where why we'd asked for planners seeking changes from the staff position to mark up your position. So what would you say if you're looking at Mr. Stener's Appendix A, which he sets out the provisions?
Well, it doesn't actually include this one.
Pardon?
Sorry to interrupt, but it doesn't include this one because this is Mr. Stener's preliminary view. He puts it in evidence, but he doesn't include it in his track changes.
He doesn't include it in his track changes.
No.
Okay. So, and he was waiting to hear from Ms. Macbeth. Is that right? That's why it was a preliminary review? Jacob?
Yeah, that's essentially correct. I think as the further we get into this topic, I think it's sort of, I'll address this in my right of reply tomorrow, but I think that it's probably a matter that would benefit from hearing the evidence on that particular chapter as well, and sort of finalising that view.
Okay, so there's no dispute that the rules in the coastal environment chapter should be exempt. So that's your position, Jacob, Ms. Carter's, and also Ms. Macbeth's. That's right. So there's some discussion about the applicability of those policies to the restricted discretionary matters. And there's no dispute also about whether those policies should be relevant for discretionary or non-complying activities in the port zone. Is that the position?
As I understand it, Ms. Carter, that's your position as well in terms of those fully discretionary activities. Yes.
That those policies would be live for fully discretionary and non-complying, but wouldn't be for what we're arguing is that they're unnecessary here as a matter of restricted discretion.
Yes. So the plan drafting hasn't been agreed because there's still this discussion about how they apply to restricted discretionary status.
Mm-hmm. That's my understanding of the area of disagreement right now.
Okay. Jacob, is that where you're at too?
Sorry, could you just repeat that, please?
So the only area of disagreement is whether those policies relate as matters on restricted discretionary activities.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So look, I think when I'm now, I hope I'm clear. I think I'm clear. David, did you have any follow-up questions on this?
Just one on it. I don't want to complicate it. I'm just mindful of the minute that we sent out on matters of discretion some time ago, where we expressed a concern that the matters of discretion had become so broad as to really be fully discretionary matters and drag. And I'm just wondering, at some stage, Mr. Stener, that's a question I'd like you to consider. I think I know Ms. Carter's answer on it. Effectively, I think what she's saying is that that effectively they really make the activity status a quasi discretionary activity, which is what the effect of the rules would be under the coastal environment anyway. I think.
Yes.
At the very least. Okay. That's the only point I would add. Just for Ms. Carter though, you've said you're going to you've made a change to your paragraph 13 in your summary, I think it was.
Yes.
It would be useful when you do tidy that up, whether you could tidy that change up and any changes that flow through as a consequence to your evidence in chief, because as I said, I hadn't read your summary for whatever reason. I'd read your evidence in chief, and I don't know whether the same correction needs to be made to your evidence in chief in terms of rules rather than the term provisions.
I'm pretty sure I used the word rules in my evidence in chief, but I will definitely check that and make sure that it's consistent.
Yes, because it's those documents we'll go back to in our deliberations, and that just to support what the chair said in relation to the importance of track changes and them being complete.
Okay.
We put a lot of store on those because our memory is only so good. So
yeah, that's fine. I will do that by the end of the week.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Yes, and thank you, Port Taranaki team. Thank you, Morgan. It's been
Commissioner, just
been a long
one,
day. Is everything-
one final matter, sir, if I may,
Yeah.
just to, I realised I didn't tell you before something that I should have about the EDF, the Port Otago decision, which is that it is being appealed. I can't take that any further, but leave for that appeal was granted 4 days ago, and the Supreme Court is due to hear that on the 11th and 12th of April. So I'm not sure how that aligns or not with your timing, but I just put that on your radar so that you're aware that that's
under appeal.
The full position. Yeah.
I wonder whether we'll get a decision any faster than the King Salmon one, which I think sat with the Supreme Court for a while, but we can't criticise that. It's all good. Thanks for that clarification.
Okay.
And look, apologies if there's been any confusion through some of these questions. I was driven to an understanding that we were looking at exempting the whole coastal environment, and that's perhaps got us a wee bit down a rabbit hole, but we got there in the end, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we will return tomorrow just in relation to the verbal right of reply and just the steps going forward. So, Morgan, it's quite important that someone sort of is perhaps there for the port when we do hear the right of reply, whether it's you or Janice or someone, just so we can sort of agree together the next steps. It's been pretty helpful when we have these specific zones where there's one or two parties that are really central to the issue.
There'll definitely be some attendance for the port. I can
Great,
confirm that.
appreciate that. And Ross and Julia, thank you very much for your attendance. And Janice, we'll look forward to that addendum by the end of the week. On that basis, I think we can adjourn until 9 a.m. in the morning. Apart from a karakia, which I forgot once, and I do know Sarah's shouldering the brunt of this at the moment. There's quite often a few other people online we can share it around, but Sarah, if you were there, lovely to finish with the karakia. Thank you.
Kapa. O tēnā tātou, kia pai te pō. He karakia whakamutunga, ki runga, ki raro, ki roto, ki waho, rire, rire hau, pai mā rire. Hei a pōpō.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone's attendance.
Right.